Morning, everybody. So I'm going to go over a lecture over Chapter 8, which is Introduction to Responsive Web Design. So that's the topic, and again, like I always like to start off with the importance of why this is important. And this is honestly one of my favorite lectures to give because of the answer to that question, why is it important? If you're building a web page in 2020, it goes without saying almost that your web page should look good on a cell phone. Your web page should look good on a tablet. Your web page should look good on a widescreen monitor or on one of those monitors from 2003 that's perfect square. I forget what the dimensions are, but you know what I mean. It should look good on any device, and then even more than that, our websites, more and more devices are accessing them, and so you walk into Best Buy nowadays, and you got smart refrigerators. You got at the home show, if you go to see the latest what technology in homes, you see smart blinds, you see obviously cars that have browsers built into them. These cars are driving themselves down the road, and you can just be on your tablet built into the car. So there's all these devices, and all these devices have different dimensions to view the website on, which is the challenge. And so how do you solve that challenge? The answer is responsive web design. So this is a term that became popular shortly after the release of the iPhone, because in 2007, I think, when the iPhone came out, before that, we just all, we coded websites for desktops, and it was easy. And then all of a sudden, all these different cell phones came out, and they all had different dimensions in portrait and landscape mode. And I was like, oh man, what are we going to do about this? How does the industry respond? Well, they responded with these concepts of responsive web design. And so I do enjoy this topic because, again, if you're building websites more modernly, you have to build them to respond. And so everything we've been doing up until now, we haven't really considered this a lot. What does our website look like in different dimensions of, resolutions, and different height and different widths of different devices? And so, we're going to, this chapter, the book does an okay job, but I certainly think there's enough resources outside of the book that a lot of our homework and our labs and things like that are not out of the textbook. So the textbook does not do a good job of showing off and having us utilize tools that are industry standards. So I'm going to kind of highlight the good stuff out of the chapter. A lot of theory is good, but as far as the practice and how to write the code, we're going to go outside the book quite a bit. And so we've touched on these concepts of a fixed layout. A fixed layout is very rigid. You're using pixels and points. Fluid layouts, you're using percents and viewport widths and things of that nature. It just responds. You can bend it. It's fluid. Fixed, there's no bending fixed. It is what it is. And what I mean by bend is you can resize the browser window, and as you resize the browser window, things within it respond. Right? So this is a fluid layout that we got going on in PowerPoint here. Right? That's fluid versus fixed. It doesn't do that. Again, a lot of these theories we use relative font sizes, and so up until now we've used viewport width and viewport height on layout, but our font sizes, a lot of times we're just still using pixels and points, and so we want to use things like M's and Rems and these different measurements that are relative, so they kind of can grow and get smaller. We're going to look again at this meta element. So we've seen the meta element in the early chapters. We've seen the meta element with meta keywords, meta char set. And so those are a couple ways we've already seen this meta tag. It's coming back again, and it's a pretty simple tag, and I'll explain what it does, because it helps us with getting our web page to look. It's an important tag, because if you don't include it, then our website's not going to look how we want it to look in mobile devices. Really important is this concept of what is a CSS media query. I almost wish there was an easier name for it. Why it's called a media query, but it's just not a name that people remember when they're first learning it easily. So I almost wonder if there could be an easier name to remember. But what a media query is a foundational way to make your code respond differently at different widths of your browser. So if you've got a widescreen monitor, you would use this CSS. But if you're on an iPhone, you would use a different piece of CSS. And so media queries are a way that can identify how wide your screen is, and then based on the width of your screen, implement or use CSS rules for that width. And so media queries are one of the key tools that are used in responsive web design. If there's one takeaway from this introduction, is that media queries are the building block for how this is done. Now, media queries is the code that you write. So you write media queries to perform this task of responsive web design. And then here's described 2 approaches for developing media queries for responsive web design. We'll see there's a couple of ways that this could be done. So that's a good question. So Drew asked, a lot of sites have mobile versions and desktop versions. Is that something different that we're talking about? Yes, it is. That is another approach where you have totally different URLs. One URL is the specific URL for mobile, and another is the specific URL for desktop. Now, just as YouTube was our example, you notice I'm on YouTube, and whatever these videos are, this is my instructor account. So I think at one point I might have, of course, Key and Peele, whatever, talks at Google. Okay, is gaming healthy? Interesting. I can resize this, and it's responding differently, but it's still youtube.com. And so to me, that looks more like a media query that's changing the layout than a totally separate version of YouTube. Yes, of course, gaming is healthy. I'm not going there. So I've already given an example of responsive web design. Obviously, it looks, what responsive web design is one site, one web page. You code it one time, and that web page looks one way on a widescreen monitor, and that one page looks different on a mobile device. And so that's all responsive web design is just a way to code your site that looks appropriate on each device. Some main components of responsive web design, Fluid layout. So the way we do fluid layout, as we've already covered, is we use things like percentages, and we use things like viewport width and viewport height for all of our page layout. So for what we did in chapter 6, the measurements that we use are percents and viewport width, viewport height. We also introduced this tool called media queries. We're going to learn media queries today, and that's what our homework is going to be over some media queries. And we also work with scalable images, and that's just a little bit of HTML and CSS. It's just an image tag, and we learn to code our images in a way that essentially get bigger and get smaller. In other words, they scale. And so really what's new to this chapter are these two things: media queries, which are certainly the more challenging part, and then scalable images is really just a couple lines of code that we learn to get our images to get bigger and get smaller. Now, when it comes to testing responsive web design, what can we do? And there's a couple of things to test, okay? Number one, you can actually make the website go live and then test it on whatever devices you want to test it on. So if you want to test it on an iPhone and your Galaxy Note, Samsung Galaxy Note, which is a huge cell phone, and a small iPhone, and you want to test it on your widescreen monitors, that's fine. Yeah, I don't really, that's an option. Not my favorite option, because you typically don't want a website, on a server until it's really ready to be live. Device emulators, browser simulators, virtual machines in various ways. This is a better way of testing, in my opinion, in that, there are cell phone emulators. So this is software you install on your computer, and you can use these emulators to emulate a cell phone, to act like a cell phone. Virtual machines, right? So you would install essentially a fake computer. You could think of it as a fake computer, if that's a way you want to think of a virtual machine. So here on my computer, I'd have some software running on this laptop, and I'd run that software, and through that software, this is a Windows computer, but maybe I install Linux, right? And then I would have this fake running Linux machine running inside of some software on my laptop. And if I want to see how my web page looks on Linux, I could run a virtual machine and then put on, whatever browser that you want to use in a Linux environment, and see how that web page responds in that environment. Probably the most that we're going to do in this class, though, is the developer tools that are built into the browsers. And so I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but when you're using the inspect tool, let's just go to YouTube. One thing that you can do is just resize the browser window, and that kind of gives you an idea of how it's going to look at different widths. But built into the developer tools, if I inspect, we've got this inspect tool right here, and I've been using this all semester long, especially with margin and padding and positioning, to understand, for example, what's going on here. Oh, this is an image. If I click this image, what's the CSS that's being applied to this image? So I use this tool a lot. But right next to this is toggle device toolbar. And this is a tool that I can click here and see if I say, okay, what does this look like on a Pixel 2? What does this look like on an iPad? What does this look like on... So you can get an idea, and then when you're using these devices, obviously you don't have a mouse, so your cursor changes to a like a little finger touch. And this is okay. This tool built in is okay to generally get an idea. You can edit the devices on here because these are a little bit old. My gosh, iPhone 6, 7, 8, iPhone X. These devices are old. You can edit some of these. You can add custom devices. Definitely can get some different dimensions built into your default settings here. Now, at some point, you need to turn that off though, because if you pull this away, it does go back to normal, but then now the inspect is still in this device toolbar. So when it comes into this kind of formatting, if you don't want that, you need to turn this back off. And everything's running a little slow right now. I guess my computer's being bogged down. Come on. Anyways, it's just a setting that you toggle on and off. I do not know why I'm running so slow. Okay. So Parker asked a question, is the Surface a good device? Microsoft Surface? Yeah, I've had nothing but good reviews. I've heard nothing but good reviews about Microsoft Surface devices. Specifically for coding, I've never used it. Troy here says that he liked it. He had one at one point. So that's one. So again, just kind of looking at layouts. When it comes to responsive web design, we want to use fluid layouts, and when we use fluid, we use percentages. Obviously if it was fixed, we would use pixels. And so definitely you can get the same layout from fixed into fluid, but generally, the benefits of fluid is that the layouts are proportional, so they'll fit on all screen sizes equally. They're scalable, so they'll adapt to new sizes, and that's getting back into like, hey, we don't know what the latest Tesla's screen dimensions are for the tablet inside of a Tesla. We're not going to know that, but it will automatically adapt to that screen since our layouts are scalable. So that's a nice part. And then sometimes you don't need media queries because you've seen that you get some responsiveness out of the box, you could say. And things will scale down and scale up decently. However, a lot of times you want to improve kind of like the out of the box how it works. And so oftentimes you do end up writing your own custom media queries. Now, when you're looking at like a fixed to fluid, like you could code it either way. There are, in the book kind of gives you some math to convert. Like if you were coding an older fixed layout and you're converting it into a newer fluid layout, there's some math involved. To me, that's not really super important, as far as how to calculate. If it was fixed and we want to get into fluid, more than likely, if you're dealing with an older site, I've done this several times and I've never had to do these calculations. So it's not super important as far as I'm concerned. Okay, just taking a look at the chat. Everything's looking good. When it comes to responsive design, again, we've covered viewport height quite a bit at this point. Again, that's the height of your screen. And so 1%, 1 VH is 1%. 1 VW is 1% of the width. Vmin, 1% of the smallest dimension. Let's see if I can expand on that. I don't use Vmin a lot. Vmin is the minimum between the height or the width. Oh, okay. So, yeah, I just needed a refresher. Sorry, I forgot. Just being honest. So, what is smaller? Is your height smaller or is your width smaller? Because that's 1% of the smaller, be it the width or the height. Vmin is a minimum between the height or width in percentage, depending on which is smaller. Then we got Wmax. Here's Vmax. Vmax, so it's Vmin and Vmax. This has a typo right here. That's Vmin. I thought it was wrong. Vmin and Vmax. Vmax is the maximum between the height or width in percentage, depending on which one's bigger. Don't use those two quite as often. And so, they kind of give some examples where we're scaling the body to be viewport width. Again, we've been using this for a while now, so don't really hit too hard on those. We've been using them. I'll be doing some more code examples when we get into media queries. When it comes to font sizes, though, so positioning, we were already essentially doing fluid layouts. You were already tested over this. So those last 5 or 6 slides, a little bit of review, I think. Sometimes we start doing things in the class before we lecture on them, which is good, because then by the time we lecture on them, they're a review. When it comes to font sizes, we can use percents. These are called M's. These are called rems. Let's talk about that. So, percentage is based on a default height, which is 16 pixels. And so when you say 200%, it's twice the default 16 pixels. So you get 32. So 200% is 32. So the percent is based on a default. M's, as we might remember, is the capital letter M of the current font. So if we say 2 M's, that's twice the size of the capital letter M of the current font. Whatever font that may be. Because M's in different fonts, capital letter M's, are different sizes. So percent is based on a default. M's are based on the current font. And then there's rem. Rem stands for root M. And that's root M. Whereas M is the capital letter M of the current font. Rem, a rem is the root font. Now, what do you mean the root font? Well, all that's saying is, what's the root of an HTML document? Well, the root of an HTML document, let's see what I mean by root. Open folder, homework, chapter 8. Here we go. So in this case, the root means what is the tag that all the other tags are nested within? Well, all the other tags are nested within this HTML tag. So this HTML tag would be known as our root. So what is the font of our root? There's a default font, but if we were to come into here and style the HTML tag to have a font family of Arial, okay, now our root font is Arial. And so you're talking about the capital letter M on our root, which is HTML. So everything in body right now, default font for everything is Arial because we set the root font here. But if we were to maybe write a paragraph, and then we were to say, okay, paragraphs font family of this, Cambria, okay, well then paragraph would not be Arial. The paragraph would be Arial. And then if we were to say font size 2Ms, okay, if we say font size 2Ms, it would be of the current font, which is Cambria. But if I were to say font size 2 rems, this would be 200% of Arial, right? Because this is root M's versus the current font. That's the difference. Difference between rems and M's. Again, the default font size is 16 pixels. And that's a rundown of font sizes with M's, rems, or percents. So for positioning, we use viewport width, viewport height in percents. For fonts, we use percents, M's, and rems. And that's how you make fluid layouts. And that's kind of that's your foundation. Using those measurements in those ways are your foundations for responsive web design. So, decent amount of information there. Some of it's new, some of it's not, but really good foundational to making responsive websites. Scaling images, all right, before we get into media queries, scaling images is actually not too hard. The way that we scale images is with our CSS, we're going to use the max width property. Okay, and again, this just allows the images to get bigger and smaller based on how much room they have in their browser window. Okay, so obviously here we've got this nice big image, and if we were to scale the browser window down, it would just get smaller. It would be proportional. Okay, so if we look at the HTML for this, it's real simple. The HTML, so here's the important thing here. There's no height and there's no width on the HTML. All we have is an image tag. No height, no width. So remove any height and width from the HTML. Then we target that image. Let's just, in the sake of this example, that image is a child of a section tag. So we've got a descendant selector here. And you set the max width to 100%. And it says, if we look at the notes here, causes the image to be scaled down but not up. The width is limited to the native width of the image. So in other words, if you got this huge image, it's still going to be huge on the web page. But if you were to size the browser window down, the image would get smaller. And so if you didn't want your image to be so big, you would set the width to 100% instead of max width, and then you would set the max width to 400 pixels. So these are two ways. It just depends. Do you want the image to be as wide as it is by default? Because a lot of times people set the width in the HTML. Well, we're no longer doing that. We're no longer setting the width in the HTML. Here, you'd set the width in the CSS, and then you would just set the width property to 100%. So two ways of doing this. And again, I don't think the code is overly complex. You just have to see it. You have to do it a time or two. And that's an easy way to make scalable images for responsive web design. Now, we'll do this as part of your homework. Part of your homework tonight, you will make a scalable image using either one of these techniques, okay? Okay. Let's take a 15-minute break. I'm going to pause. No questions at the moment. We'll take 15 minutes. We'll come back. Okay, we are back from a break. We're going to resume. Got just a couple more topics to talk about, one of which being arguably the most important topic in this chapter. The meta tag with the name of viewport is a tag that we have to add, and it looks just like I have it here on slide 27, where you have the meta tag name of viewport. You set the content equal to the width of device width, initial scale of 1. Okay, literally that's a copy and paste, and should be in any website that's responsive web design, that you're coding today. Basically, this is add this to your template, add this to your boilerplate code that you code on every HTML page. In fact, it's already there for us. I didn't code that. If you wondered what that is, that was put to us there by our Emmet, E-M-M-E-T. This is an extension that comes with Visual Studio. You get this for free by using Emmet. What is this tag? It's obviously used in responsive web design, but how so? If you've ever been to a website on a mobile device and it looks like the page on the screenshot on the left, it's zoomed out essentially. And a user, you have to pinch the screen, to zoom in. Versus on the right. Now on the right, that's not using media queries. That's not really using like a responsive layout or anything like that. But it is zoomed in. And so websites, when you go on your mobile device, you get this kind of zoomed in view of the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And that's just going to make it much more easy to use. So to zoom the page into the upper left, that's the importance of this tag. And if we're viewing our page on a mobile device, you obviously want to be like on the right. Now we need to finish the coding of that site so that it looks like a traditional mobile site. But the first step in doing this is getting it to zoom in. And you do that with the meta viewport. Meta name viewport. Okay, and so it's boilerplate code that we've actually been writing it for a while, but maybe you just never stopped and wondered what is that doing. If you're using that Emmet, like most of you are. And there are other properties to consider. But most of the time you don't touch this. Most of the time you just leave that in there for what it is. If you want to break down different properties, we have that listed for you. Last topic. Finally get to write some code. CSS media queries. I think I'm just going to write the code to kind of show you. Because these slides are okay, but I'd rather just code this, and then we can kind of cover the slides afterwards. Media queries are done in your CSS with the @media screen. This is actually a selector. Remember, we have CSS selector property value. So we're working with the @media screen selector. You guys can hear me? Okay, cool. So here you could see, I just jumped ahead, @media only screen and max width. This is actually our selector. So this is how you write a CSS media query. This is how you would write a separate media query. This is how you write another media query. Let's do a fluid page layout with media queries. Grab a normalize real quick. Okay, got a normalize box sizing border box. Again, there's floats, and we learned positioning with floats. During that lecture, I also described the display of inline block, which I'm a fan of. Not that it doesn't have its own quirks like floats do. just glance at it right now because I'm just whipping this all together. Okay, we got a little bit of overflow going on. Just do 33%. Got a header. Header, 3 articles. We can resize, and we kind of see it automatically, like I said earlier in the lecture, it kind of automatically has a default behavior that this third article kind of flows down. So if we actually filled this up with content, and again, you get some out-of-the-box responsiveness when you're using fluid layouts. So that's nice. But what if you want to change this? That's where media queries come in. So maybe at this point, when you start to resize the browser down, maybe I just want a 1-column layout instead of like we got 2 columns. Really, here is what's going on. So how do we do that? So the first thing is you define what are called the breakpoints, and the breakpoints are, okay, this is your widescreen monitor, but when I hit a certain pixel width, I want to write the code differently. And so you got to say, okay, well, what is the width that you want to set your breakpoints? So, you could set up, do a common media query. Look up common media queries. And they give you, these are your breakpoints. And there's a whole bunch of them here. And so it can be very daunting until what you wind up finding is that you put different styles in all of these breakpoints for all of these different scenarios. Okay, so this is pretty, complex. But let's take a look at what this is. Minimum width. There's minimum width and then there's max width. Which are kind of, you gotta stop and think about. So if you look at this one, it says the minimum width is 768 and the max width is 1024. So you know that, on the smallest end it can be this wide, and on the high end it can be that wide. And so what we wind up doing, and there's a little bit of an example here for desktop first design, you got to start thinking about, okay, well, what do I want to code first? Do I want to code all the CSS for the desktop first and then scale down? And so here, this code with no media queries, and so just your normal CSS, there's no media queries, would be for 960 pixels or greater. Okay. And then we start scaling down. We say, okay, well, from 959 to 768, right? So we're scaling down. We would set the max width is now 959. So with no media queries, essentially what I've done here. In this example, I have no media queries, right? There's no media queries yet in this CSS. And then we say, okay, well, if I start to shrink the width and the width goes below 959, then let's put CSS rules in here. So I'm going to actually just take this kind of from the book. Okay, and I'm going to demonstrate how this would work. You see my fave icon was cached? That's, never mind. My fave icon was cached from someone's hands-on test. So here's a media query. This goes in our CSS. And this is what this looks like. It says, okay, as soon as the width goes below 959, as soon as it goes below 959, let's change the article. I'm just going to change the font color of my article. Color to this. Okay? And by default, the color is black. So let's just code that in color black, text color black. Okay, let's see. I just wanted to do the most simple media query. Okay. So you see that I changed the width of my browser, and when I hit that breakpoint, it changes the font color. So this is called a desktop down approach, meaning you code the CSS for your widescreen monitor first, and then as you scale down, now we could say, okay, if we get even smaller, so this was portrait layout on a tablet, this is mobile layout in landscape. So this is a little bit smaller. So then the next media query, smaller, let's change the article's font color to red. Okay, so by default it's black. At this breakpoint it goes green. At that breakpoint it goes red. Green into red. And it's all based on these breakpoints. What was the scenario I said? I said, I don't want inline. At a certain point, I want it to be block. So instead of, let's do this. Let's do display block. So it's going to go from a display. Got an extra curly right there. No, I don't. There we go. So it can become, make sure we indent nice and pretty. Let's do this. Let me format this. There we go. So you can see how the curlies line up. So we actually have, so this is a selector. And inside of here, we can have multiple, let's say footer color chocolate. Now you see at this point, at a certain breakpoint, the layout goes into a single column. Why is it a single column? It's a single column because I changed the display property from inline block into block. Now what I don't like is that there's this little spot right here, all right, that's still 2 column, and then at this point it goes to 1 column. So what that means to me is I need to increase my, maybe let's do, that's 60. Let's do 970. So now I go right from the 3 column. Nope, still not quite there. Let's do 990. Right from the 3 column, right to the 1 column. And you can also see that at that point, when this breakpoint is hit, it changes the article and it changes the footer. So these are media queries. Pros and cons to using these. You have extreme control. You have so much down to the pixel control of what your screen looks like at what width. There's, again, this is just the most control over your page layout and over your styles as you can have. That's great. That's the pro. Advantage. Disadvantage. Boy, you write your CSS. Look how many times we had to style this article tag. We had to style the article tag. We had to style its positioning. Primarily its positioning. I mean, I'm changing the color. Typically you're not doing that. But you had to style its positioning for desktops, for tablets, for iPhone, for all these different scenarios. So what you wind up having is multiple styles for the same thing. When you're only styling for one desktop monitor, a widescreen, then you only have to write your CSS once. And so what winds up happening here is you wind up writing CSS for the article here, you write up CSS for the article here, you write CSS for the article 3, 4, 5, 6 times for all these different widths. So it's a lot of control, but it's a lot of code. And one technique is to kind of start to break up your CSS. And you can do this, right? You can have multiple external style sheets. So you can keep your desktop styles in one style sheet. You could keep this media query, this entire media query. And this could be hundreds of lines of code just for this media query. I've got 10 lines of code, 5 lines of code, whatever. This could be hundreds of lines just within this media query. And so you can extract it to its own external CSS. And that kind of helps organize your media queries. So extracting media queries into their own CSS file and then just linking to them just like we have here. I would link to my normal styles first, then I would link to my max width of 1,000 pixels, then I would link to my max width of 767 pixels. Will we ever learn an easier way to group them together? The best thing to do is to extract it. I mean, so this is all embedded, right? So here's my example of extracting. So I'm going to cut, Control X. I'm going to add desktop styles.css. I'm going to paste. And then here, I'm going to link to my desktop styles.css. I'm going to cut these styles, and if I look back at the PowerPoint says this is tablet portrait. So I'm going to add a new one. I'll say tablet AIT. Tablet portrait, save that there, link to tabletportrait.css. That's that's really the best way to organize. And functionally, this page is going to be the same. Nothing has changed. Yeah, that's what you do for that. So that's responsive web design. Again, you could Google the common device breakpoints and you get a million of them. And so you can have as much or as little control as needed. You got to have the viewport meta tag. That's your fundamentals of media queries. And you could put this one in its own as well. This one is the mobile landscape. So I'd make a new one. Mobile landscape.css, cut, paste, save, link to mobile landscape.css. Now I've got no embedded styles. I just have all of my media queries saved in different style sheets. Now the other approach, which is arguably better, I would argue that I prefer a mobile first design. Okay, so if you have a desktop, you can scale down, which is what we did in our demonstration. However, mobile design is harder than desktop design. Mobile design is more challenging because you have less space for things to go on. And so it becomes a discussion. What needs to go up above the fold? Above the fold? What goes above the fold on mobile? There's not much real estate there. You don't have much room. And so you got to throw away a lot of things that you can have above the fold on desktop. You can't have above the fold on mobile. And so the way this is done is you code your mobile first. And so the styles with no media queries, right? The styles with no media queries you code first. And then you code the minimum width of 480 pixels. So instead of starting big and scaling down, you start small and then start adding minimum width. Okay, once it grows to this big, then here's the styles for that width. Once it grows to this big, here's the styles for that width. Okay, so given the option, my recommendation is to start with mobile, a mobile first design, okay, and scale up, which is what is done here, as opposed to a desktop first design, which starts no media queries for the desktop, and then you scale down with max width. This is no styles for your mobile, and you scale up with minimum width. Now, okay, media queries, that's your first exposure to them. They offer an extreme amount of precision when it comes to styling your pages on the different devices. However, there are tools that make this job easier. Okay, we're learning media queries today, and they're very important for the foundation, right? The foundation of responsive web design. But there are tools that make it easier, and we will cover some of those tools as in the next couple of chapters. Okay, the one tool that I introduced today is a nav bar that's mobile friendly. And so you're probably used to this here. All my analogies are cheeseburgers. This is what they call the hamburger menu, right? You got if you've been on a mobile device, you've seen this hamburger menu, right? It looks like a little burger there. This is done with this tool called SlickNav, okay? And what SlickNav is some JavaScript, and more specifically, it's some jQuery. Okay, and we're going to get into JavaScript and jQuery in this in this semester. Okay, so we will learn this kind of code. Okay, but we're not quite there yet. Really, right now, we just need to learn the basics of how to use this slick nav. And what this does is it really simplifies our nav bar and positioning. And so our cheeseburger is my favorite food. No, that's what that's not my call. That's what they call that. You never call that the yeah, anyways. So this slick nav is a tool. I'll show you how to use it real quick. It'll be a part of your homework. So this is a good thing here. What I don't have here is a nav tag. So let's look up slick nav. Slick nav is useful for us at this point. Before you continue to slick nav, a standard secure... No, get out of here with that. Don't start clicking on websites and installing extensions. There's no need for an extension. This is why I wanted to do this. Look at this. Be careful, folks. Some of these sites aren't. I'll give you the link in chat. This is looking better. Okay. See what happens there is at a certain point the nav bar breaks and you get the cheeseburger menu. So what's nice about this is they actually give us the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. Let's check this out. So looking at this, you got some links to some local normalize. You got a link to a local navigation.css. I'm assuming that's what this CSS is. But then there's also slicknav.css. So this is actually our slicknav.css. So what you wind up doing is you link, and this is maybe we could just use this code right in here. We link, instead of looking it up online, to a slicknav.css. And so this happens to be a local file, as you can see here. And then we link to jQuery. And it says get the newest version of jQuery, so you can update this to a newer version. So you link to slicknav CSS, you link to jQuery, you link to a slicknav JavaScript file. So link to jQuery, link to SlickNav JavaScript, and then you write a little function yourself. So let's just take this verbatim right out of the PowerPoint. Let's pop this in our code, in our head. I'm going to format that. Now the one thing that I'm missing is the SlickNav CSS. And I'm also missing the SlickNav JS. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. And here we see CSS for the SlickNav. Code the SlickNav plugin in the head element. This is let's look there. That's not a bad idea, Drew. So let's look in our home, in our labs, and then there's the shape up project. There's JavaScript. There's SlickNav JavaScript, so I'm going to copy that. And this is in the shape up project, right? So I'm going to go back into homework, chapter 8. I'm going to make a JS folder for JavaScript. I'm going to paste SlickNav JavaScript, and I'm going to go back and get in the CSS file. The next is the CSS file. So again, I go into labs, shape up, and then styles. There's SlickNav. Homework, chapter 8. I'm going to make a new folder. Styles. So there is a SlickNav CSS and there's a SlickNav JS. Now let's link to them properly. And actually, I believe I do that. JS/. There we go. And SlickNav CSS. So now I'm linking to this properly. I'm linking to this properly. Now this script tag, you haven't done this before, but this is what's called a CDN, Content Delivery Network. The source is a live site on the internet that points to a JavaScript file. So it's not a local source resource. It's online. So we got local resource, online. So comment here. Below is SlickNav CSS. Then we've got jQuery. Then we've got SlickNav JavaScript. And then this is basically, this is the JavaScript to tell SlickNav to start. Like it's basically like this is like the go. Like without this, there's no go and it's not going to work. So this is kind of like start running, so to speak. And again, we'll get more into what in the world's going on here. That's something that we can worry about a little bit later. Now we do have to code our markup in a certain way. If you notice, there's an ID of mobile menu and there's an ID of nav menu. Then there's an unordered list, then there's list items. So just like we learned in our last chapter, inside of a nav we've got an unordered list and full of list items. So let's copy, and let's put that inside of a nav bar right here. Control C, Control V, format. Okay, and let's just have a few more links. Anchor tags, LIA. Now, interestingly enough, that nav closes and that nav opens. So this two different nav tags. And so the JavaScript, what it'll do is it'll hide this nav bar and display this nav bar. The mobile menu will be built out of whatever you put inside of the normal menu. So that's actually what the JavaScript does. The JavaScript kind of codes everything inside of here based on what you have in here. Okay, now clearly on some level this is working, and on another level it's not working because all I'm getting is the mobile menu. So I need to troubleshoot why that is. I'm going to pause the recording because it doesn't need to extend with me troubleshooting here. I'm going to look at this. Okay, I just needed to finish. I'm not done yet. And so I spent a minute and I go, wait a minute. There's a little bit more CSS to write. And so we need to write this CSS for SlickNav, and so it's a media query. I thought there was a media query involved. Let's break down this media query. So let's write a style tag. So here we're saying when there's a maximum width of this number of pixels, so is anything not as wide, we hide the desktop menu and display the mobile menu. All right, now we need to write it the other way. In other words, normally the mobile menu display none, and the nav menu let's do display block. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. The mobile menu is not displaying. Once we break the viewport, then it does display. So we had to write a little bit of custom code here. And obviously this nav bar, well, now what do we do with this nav bar? Well, this is just in our CSS that we're writing here. Let's do nav menu If we do display inline, no, let's do, either way will work. Let's do list style type of none. Nav menu. Nav menu is the nav bar. So list style type needs to go on the UL. UL list style type of none. Nav menu ULLI display inline. So now we're getting our nav bar to go across. Nav menu. So I haven't done this in a year, but it's ULLIA display block. Width of 5 viewport width. Display inline. So each LI, what we'll do, space those out. Well, and basically what we did last chapter is what you would continue to put in here with background color, you know, making these look like buttons. Right? But then once you shrink down, you get slick nav. Okay. That's a little tool. It's kind of useful until we learn some other tools. And then we'll find out that other tools are got the navigation kind of taken care of in a different way. But it's just a tool. Again, you know, what I found useful to do this, and so for the folks following along, the code for SlickNav, a lot of it is in the PowerPoint. I would say 90% of what you need, 95% of what you need is in this PowerPoint between these two slides. The only thing that's missing, because this is a media query for like once you get below this number of pixels, well, then you also had to style the nav bar for above that, right? So what I did, this is just your normal style for a nav bar. So maybe you should code the nav bar styles first, and then code the media query for SlickNav, because that's going to work. So Drew asked a question, is Rankin using SlickNav when you make the rankin.edu? Are they using SlickNav? And you might, that's a good guess. It works the same way. Like, look, here's our nav. And then it goes into this. SlickNav is not the only tool that's out there to do this. There are other tools, and I know that rankin.edu is not using SlickNav, and I can tell that by inspecting up in the head. You can kind of look at what tools they're using. And there's nothing about SlickNav in here that I remember seeing. You can see I can kind of perform a search. Oh, there's tons of tools based on JavaScript. Yeah. Yeah, and we definitely cover a lot of those. I was going to show you the tool that they're using, but it's not showing up in my search. We're going to cover this tool called Bootstrap that does the same thing, and that's primarily that's like the industry standard, is this tool called Bootstrap. And so we're going to cover Bootstrap as early as next chapter. It's just another tool. So there you go, folks. That is the basics of responsive web design. So again, pretty cool chapter. Very important chapter. Obviously, you're building websites, modern websites. You need to understand a lot of this chapter. So very important stuff. Tonight, over the weekend, definitely read chapter 8 here. I think we're on chapter 8. Is that the number we're on? Yeah, chapter 8. Read chapter 8, and I'm going to give you a homework assignment to work on over the weekend that'll be due on Monday. Let's take a look. I'm going to stop the recording. Let's take a look at the syllabus. All right, stopping the recording.